Good morning. I'm going to call to order this Elections and Rules meeting for July 22nd. It's Wednesday. My name is Jacob Fry. I'm the chair of this committee. We have a quorum of the City Council, and joining me are council members Kano, Glidden, Yang, Quincy, Warsami, Goodman, and Palmisano. Colleagues, there are two items on the agenda for today, both of which will be presented by our clerk, Mr. Carl. The first item is regarding the good, the bad, and the ugly from 2014 election, as well as the improvements that can be made prior to the 2016 election, which will obviously have a larger turnout. Mr. Carl.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and committee members. My name is Casey Carl. I have the honor to serve as City Clerk for the City of Minneapolis. And with me today are members of our Elections and Voter Services team, led by our Director, Grace Walk-LaRowitz. We're here to present, as the Chair said, the report with recommendations following the most recent election, the 2014 gubernatorial. So 2014 was a jam-packed year for us. We had a number of events, activities, and challenges, some of which are shown on this slide, which all reinforce the need to ensure a constant state of readiness to ensure that Minneapolis voters are assured of having free and fair access to exercise their voting rights at any time and under any circumstances an election is required. Across the United States, the average turnout in 2014 was about 37%, the lowest since 1942, the lowest rate in any election since World War II. Only 7 states had more than half of their eligible voters participate, which means that nearly 2/3 of all eligible voters stayed home last year. In Minnesota, just over half of eligible voters, approximately 51%, turned out for the 2014 midterm. This was down from prior midterm elections, causing the state to lose its longtime status as one of the top states in the United States for voter participation. Here at home, Minneapolis achieved a 45% turnout rate for the general election. This was slightly lower, but still basically on par with midterm turnouts in the city over the past decade. And to clarify, the 45% turnout shown on this slide differs from the report. In your report on page 3, we indicate that Minneapolis achieved a 55% turnout. And that's the difference based on how we calculate turnout versus how the state calculates turnout. It's footnoted in footnote number 4 there on page 3. Essentially in Minneapolis, we take the total number of ballots and we divide that by the total number of registered voters, including those who register on election day. So we're using those two numbers. The Secretary of State's office calculates turnout by dividing the total number of votes by an estimated number of the eligible citizen voting age population that's generated by the U.S. Elections Project based on data from the U.S. Census Bureau. So that explains the difference in calculation methods between how the city calculates turnout and how the state calculates turnout, and why those numbers are different between this slide showing 45% turnout and 55% in your report. Across the city's 125 precincts, turnout last year varied significantly as shown on this chart. Precinct 71C, serving parts of the Bryn Mawr neighborhood, achieved the highest turnout at 73.45%. That equaled about roughly 7 of every 10 voters turning out and participating. At the other extreme, Precinct 57, serving the near North, Sumner, and Glenwood neighborhoods, had the lowest turnout at just over 31%. That's roughly 3 out of every 10 voters participating. So it's an almost direct opposite reflection of Bryn Mawr. This chart, which is included on page 6 of your report, provides a heat-coded map that shows turnout according to precincts across all of Minneapolis. And so here, for your reference, we have the 5 precincts having the highest turnout or highest voter participation in the 2014 election. And here we have the 5 precincts with the lowest level of voter participation last year. And so this map obviously tells a clear story about voter participation in Minneapolis. The results in 2014 are consistent with prior years' turnout statistics. There's a clear divide in participation between precincts that are below the dividing line and those that are above it. And I want to put a pin in that conversation because I'm going to return to it in a few minutes when I talk about voter outreach and education. Above all else, 2014 was the year of absentee voting. Last year marked the debut of no-excuse absentee voting. Minnesota was the 27th state to adopt no-excuse absentee balloting, and unsurprisingly, new records for participation were set, with a 92% increase in absentee voter participation compared to the 2010 midterm. In fact, both for the 2014 primary and for the general, participation rates were the highest that they've been in several decades. As this committee knows, absentee balloting is driven by what we call the 3 Ps: people, paper, and postage. It requires a dedicated team of election judges to receive, process, accept, or reject, and tabulate absentee ballots. It requires the paper printed ballot, as well as a series of envelopes, printed instructions, and other paper forms. And finally, prepaid postage to send the absentee ballot to and have it returned by the voter. And absentee ballots don't get immediately tabulated. Instead, they're kept secure until the date when state law indicates that we can open them and accept, reject, and process them. By comparison, then, early voting is as much better an alternative that's available. It's cheaper to administer. It's significantly more secure for the voter. It minimizes chances for error or fraud and provides every voter with the exact same treatment that they would get in the polls on Election Day. It's for that reason that the city has adopted a position of support for early voting as part of its state legislative platform. And I know Secretary Simon has also expressed strong support for transitioning Minnesota from a no-excuse absentee balloting state to a true early voting state. Early voting is available in 33 states today, plus the District of Columbia, and has enjoyed strong bipartisan support at the national level. Adding early voting to the mix of options available to Minnesota's voters would enhance the process for everyone. And again, in prepping for the 2016 presidential election, our focus is on reducing the potential for long lines and wait times. Early voting could help. On the first day of absentee voting last year, speaking of long lines, we had more than 400 voters show up at City Hall. As this slide shows, in-person absentee voting was the big challenge during the primary. By contrast, in the general election, the challenge was keeping up with mailed-in absentee ballots. In addition, with your leadership, Mr. Chair, the team extended our service hours, or our in-person service hours, during that 2-week period that leads up to both the primary and the general election last year. And that included additional service hours during our weekdays, Monday through Friday, as well as additional hours on both Saturdays and, for the very first time, service hours on the 2 Sundays leading up to Election Day. In total, the city provided 35 additional service hours for in-person absentee voters. We think having those extended service hours in the 2016 presidential election will be critical to maximize voter access to the ballot box. As I said, 2014 will be remembered as the year of absentee voting. I've only brushed the surface of everything that we learned, our experiences, as well as lessons and action plans for the future. Staff has provided an extended analysis of just the absentee balloting portion that's available in your report, also under Appendix A. So despite record-setting turnout in absentee voting last year, the majority of voters continue to cast their ballots at the polls on Election Day. In 2014, Minneapolis added 8 new precincts, and we adjusted 5 polling place locations. Despite these changes, we still experienced long lines and wait times in a few areas. And this was most noticeable in our high turnout precincts in the south part of the city and those precincts with highly mobile populations, for example, near the university, where Election Day registration is critical to enable voter participation. Election Day registration, or EDR, is a wonderful tool to empower voters, and Minnesota has provided this advantage to its voters since 1974. However, EDRs require at least double the amount of time to serve a voter at the polls. And in those precincts with high turnout or high volumes of EDR voters, long lines and wait times have been and will always be a significant challenge for us. But one of the biggest problems we face is the lack of precincts and polling places to serve our voters. As this chart illustrates, over the past decade, the city's population has steadily increased, topping 400,000 today. At the same time, we've significantly cut the number of precincts, from about 145 in 2000 to a low of 117 in 2012. Again, we added 8 precincts in 2014 to put us at a total of 125 today, but it's still not enough to address the ratio of voters to precincts. In fact, we have more than 50 precincts that exceed state recommended limits of 2,000 registered voters per precinct, and of that total, more than 20 serve a registered population of voters that exceed 2,500. So if left unaddressed, we can be assured of long lines and wait times in the 2016 presidential election. This slide provides just a bit more context. Again, as you can see, there's a heat-coded map. As a quick shorthand for reference, the darker the color of the precinct, the greater the number of registered voters that are being served. So as you can see, particularly in wards 3, 12, and 13, there are a number of precincts that are just too large. At the bottom left of this slide, you can see that in 1990, the city's population was just over 368,000, with a total of 172 precincts to support voters. If you equalize the population to the number of precincts at that time, it means each precinct would have been required to serve a population of about 2,100 voters, and that still exceeds state guidelines. However, last year in 2014, the city's population had increased to over 400,000, but the number of precincts had been reduced to 125. If population and precincts were equalized last year, it would mean each precinct would have had to have served roughly 3,200 voters. That's about 1,000 voters over the state recommended guidelines. As a consequence, working with the mayor's office, we have submitted a request in the 2016 budget to add several new precincts in advance of next year's presidential election. By adding these precincts as early as possible, the city can be assured of providing sufficient notice to affected voters so that we can minimize confusion about the location of assigned polling places on election day. Election judges. Election judges are rightly described as being the foot soldiers of democracy. I love that phrase because they are on the front lines with our voters. They're in the precincts, and it's the election judges who ensure that our voters have equal, fair, and impartial access to the ballot box. In Minneapolis, we recruit, train, deploy, and manage a core of more than 2,500 election judges. As shown on this slide, these individuals fulfill a variety of roles, including head and assistant head judges, team judges, precinct support judges, healthcare judges, student judges, and absentee ballot board judges, to name just a few. And these judges complement our core full-time team of 6 professional election administrators. As the graph on the left shows, the full-time staff actually equals less than 1% of the total personnel required to conduct an election. This fact emphasizes how disproportionately dependent the city is upon a group of seasonal workers who must be thoroughly trained and who must perform to strict standards with little to no margin for error and certainly no tolerance for mistakes in the glare of the media spotlight. That Minneapolis has consistently been successful at recruiting, training, and deploying such a large group of dedicated, civic-minded individuals speaks well not only to those individuals who serve, but also to our cadre of professionals who are here today. Recruiting has become a year-round, never-ending focus for our team, and in 2014, we implemented several improvements to our training program, including separate management training for head and assistant head judges, feedback forums, and 360-degree performance reviews. Another goal for the elections division has been making our precincts look more like our communities that they serve. And toward this end, we've made efforts to recruit more judges and to place more judges in the communities where they live. The chart on the right of this slide shows that in 2014, we were successful at making some very slight changes to diversify our core of election judges. Compared to the 2010 midterm, we decreased the volume of white judges by about 10%. We increased the number of African American judges by 9 points, from 7% in 2010 to 16% in 2014. We also had a small uptick in the number of Asian election judges who participated in 2014. Much of this success resulted from our Adopt a Precinct initiative. This program is a partnership with nonprofit organizations that provides a win-win outcome. These nonprofits take on the task of recruiting election judges for us from their memberships, and then their members in turn donate their wages that they earn from being election judges back to their organizations, which provides a new fundraising stream for the organization and also gives those individuals a chance to engage in the civic life of their community. In 2014, we had successful partnerships with 7 organizations. These included the League of Women Voters of Minneapolis, Longfellow Community Council, the Somali American Parent Association, the Somali Action Alliance, Ventura Village, and Mixed Blood Theater. In total, these organizations provided us 91 new election judges in 2014. We hope to expand on the success of the Adopt a Precinct program for the 2016 presidential election. At this point, Mr. Chair, I'd like to circle back to the observation I made earlier about voter turnout and the implications of the citywide heat-colored map that I showed. The demographic contours of our nation and certainly of our community are changing, and I don't need to tell that to this committee. Minneapolis has made racial equity one of its top priorities, and it has undertaken several initiatives to move the dial on this issue. We know that even today, not all Americans have equal opportunity. Some of us, particularly those who are African American, Latino, Asian American, or Pacific Islander, American Indian, or unmarried women, are confronted with social, economic, and political inequalities. Studies show that these groups are more likely to live in poverty, more likely to receive more severe punishment and sentencing, They're underrepresented significantly at higher rates in public office and are less likely to be registered to vote and therefore even less likely to turn out and cast a ballot. And historically, these inequalities do not abate with age. As this slide illustrates, these populations are growing, and they're projected to grow significantly over the next 40 years, gaining almost 20 percentage points. Meantime, the white non-Hispanic residents are projected to decrease during that same time frame. Together, unmarried women and communities of color are what has been referred to as the emerging majority, sometimes called the rising American electorate. By 2018, it's just 3 years away, this group will collectively comprise the majority of all eligible voting age population in the United States. If this rising American electorate is registered, motivated to civic engagement, and turns out to participate in any future election, they have the potential to dramatically shift the social, economic, and political landscape in the United States. One of the most significant factors in this combined voting bloc are youth of Hispanic origin. The chart on the left on this slide shows the steady growth traced in that yellow box over a period of 6 decades. More dramatically, the chart on the right shows that the growth in future voters, those who are under age 18 or who are just turning age 18, is the most significant area for growth in our voting population. This chart, which is based on data and estimates provided by the Census Bureau, provides another visualization of population projections from 1970 through 2050. As you can see, the voting power of white non-Hispanic voters is projected to decrease year after year from 83% in 1970 to a projected 46% in 2050. At the same time, that emerging majority group is projected to continue increasing in numbers so that by 2050, they will collectively constitute a voting bloc that represents approximately 54% of the total electorate. And these projections are based only on race. They do not account for gender identity. So if the factor of unmarried women were included, the differential would be even greater. Beyond all the other negative outcomes these groups share, and which are of a concern to the City Council, there are 3 of specific interest to me in my capacity as Chief Elections Official. First, these communities are less likely to be registered to vote. Second, and as a consequence of the first, these communities are less likely to engage in the electoral process. That is, they are less likely to vote. Third, voting, it turns out, is like other social norms. It's learned behavior. And research shows that children from families where adults are registered and who actually participate in elections are more likely to do so as adults themselves. So a child who's raised in a household where that isn't the norm is less likely to do so as an adult. To put that in context, in the 2008 presidential election, the United States saw unprecedented participation by African American voters. And yet, for every voter of that majority group that participated and cast a ballot in 2008, there were 4 more eligible citizens who did not participate. And the reason is not because of a lack of interest or desire. Instead, it's because 4 of those 5 of those communities experienced problems that caused them to be unregistered and which ultimately prevented them from casting a vote. Which is why, for our voter outreach and education efforts, our focus on the first step is registration. Research from the Pew Center on the State shows that 1 in 4 Americans are not registered to vote, and 1 in 8 Americans will have or have had problems with their registration, which would prevent them from casting a ballot. One of the reasons registration disproportionately impacts this rising majority is that they are young, they're highly mobile, and they move frequently, which exacerbates registration and turnout rates. It's important to reiterate that 59% of all 18 to 29-year-olds in America are part of that group. Included in that number, 56,000 Latinos and 58,000 African Americans turn 18 each month, becoming eligible to vote. So one of the most critical steps we can take in terms of outreach is to engage these voters by stressing the importance of registration as the first step toward voting. Working with our partners at the Secretary of State's office and at Hennepin County and with other jurisdictions across the state, we intend to pursue multiple initiatives over the course of the next year to drive voter registration as our top priority. Not just because we want voters to have an opportunity to participate, and not just because we recognize voting is one of the key signs of a healthy democracy, but simply because it's the right thing to do. So with that, Mr. Chair, I'll conclude my comments by summarizing some of the recommendations and action plans that staff identified, which are shown on page 42 of your report. Obviously, we continue to strongly advocate early voting for all Minnesotan voters. We look forward to working with Secretary Simon and his team on this effort. Meantime, we will maximize the use of no excuse absentee voting as an option to engage voters early in the process. We also advocate for permissive legislation that would allow the use of qualified interpreters in polling places to assist voters who require language translation. We recognize that not all communities have similar needs, but as the largest and the most diverse municipality, this is a critical issue for us, and we need support from our state legislature to give our voters the level of service and support that they deserve so that they can participate independently and with confidence. As mentioned, we strongly recommend increasing the number of precincts in Minneapolis in advance of the 2016 presidential election to minimize any negative consequences associated with Election Day at the polls. From my soapbox, I think I've made clear the need to do a better job at pushing registration and supporting voters so that we can have a better full engagement for all of them. In addition, we want to build on the success of our Adopt a Precinct program so that we can maximize win-win solutions that serve our needs, diversify our core of election judges, and build long-term partnerships with community-based organizations. There are many, many more recommendations and action plans contained in the report, more than I have time to cover, but I've attempted to highlight for you the major issues. As we continue with plans and preparations for the 2016 presidential election, I know we'll have a chance to come back before the committee and discuss those. And with that, Mr. Chair, I would be happy to stand for any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Carl. A lot of really good information there. Do any of my colleagues have any questions or comments for Mr. Carl? Councilmember Yang.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Carl, I just want to thank you just for working so hard in terms of diversifying the election judges. And I mean, seeing those numbers increase as large as they have, I mean, that's just fantastic. And, you know, I think, I mean, for myself, representing a ward where there's low turnout, any sort of barriers such as long lines and those sorts of things, I mean, is going to just motivate people not to show up. And so, I mean, I certainly think, I mean, a lot of work needs to be put into, you know, eliminating those lines or actually getting them shorter, even in low turnout areas. I think that's really important. And I really appreciate your office and the work that it's done in terms of increasing a precinct in Ward 5 and doing several things to help folks to vote. And, you know, I've been a strong advocate of the issue of providing interpreters for people and not just allowing them to help only 3 people, but giving them the opportunity to help as many people as possible. And I understand the balance that the state has to make in terms of, you know, fairness and those sorts of things. But I mean, when you don't have anybody, I mean, it's better to have somebody to help. And so I really appreciate your office and the work that you've done. And I think it's wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Yang. Any further questions or comments for Mr. Carl? Seeing none, I will just add a couple of pieces that I wanted to highlight. One is the graph regarding the precincts. We've dramatically increased our population just in the last decade or so. Simultaneously, the number of precincts citywide has gone down. That's resulted in extraordinarily long lines in 2008 and 2012. I know many of actual council staff were going out and delivering coffee or hot chocolate just to make sure that people stayed out a little longer in the cold and sometimes in the rain. And I think that's a problem that we need to fix. We need to make sure that people have access to the ballot box. And you know, one of your other recommendations was to increase access specifically to schools. I think we do need to be reaching out to the school district, MPS, and the school board to see where those possibilities might lie. I believe it was President Obama's initiative to increase the number of schools that are used and specifically allow for a teacher workday to take place on Election Day itself, which would open the schools more, would mitigate any security concerns, and would make it easier for kids to participate in the, what is it called, young people's election. Kids voting, even easier. And secondly, just to highlight the vast disparities in terms of voting throughout the city. And if you look at the areas that vote the least, they're often the areas where you have the lowest number of homeowners. So as many of you know, we're moving forward an initiative very soon that would hopefully drastically increase the number of registered voters in those areas. So if they want to participate on Election Day, they at the very least have the ability to do so. So I don't believe that this requires a vote, but I will direct the clerk to receive and file. And with that, we'll move on to item number 2, which are a few administrative details that Mr. Carl can highlight.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. As you know, was introduced by the chair some amendments to the code dealing with elections generally, and then specifically with the conduct of municipal elections using our ranked choice voting or RCV methodology. I'm going to introduce Peter Ebnet, a management analyst with our department who has worked with the city attorney's office to craft those. You should have a new copy in front of you at the dais, and of course it has also been posted online, and he'll walk you through each of those changes.
Good morning, Chair Fry, members of the committee. My name is Peter Ebnet. I'm a management analyst in the city clerk's office. Given the unique structure of our ranked choice voting in the city of Minneapolis, after every municipal election, we work with the city attorney's office to evaluate and streamline our processes. And we have a number of small but significant recommendations for you today. In Chapter 165, staff recommends the removal of the ward boundaries. We already have a map that exists in the appendix of the code, and that's a better example to use. Election judge and sergeant-at-arms pay was removed during the simplification for the plain language charter, and we're adding it back into ordinance due to its importance. In Chapter 167, after our experiences in 2013 with sorting ranked choice voting in Microsoft Excel, staff recommends a few additional changes for elimination. The idea is that the first, second, and third choice vote totals for all candidates will be calculated and compared to the highest vote total. All candidates whose sum, even with their first, second, and third choice votes added together, isn't higher than the highest vote total will be eliminated. And essentially, this will allow us to eliminate multiple candidates per round and will speed up the process fairly significantly. Staff also recommends removing a holdover from the 2009 election, which required the vote tabulation center to be accessible. In 2009, when the entire count was by hand, this was necessary to ensure that candidates and the public felt comfortable with what was going on. But now that the process is completed entirely on spreadsheets, it can be replicated by members of the public or the media, and so there's no need to broadcast the work on a computer screen. Staff also recommends a change to the requirements for campaign finance disclosure. Given that Minneapolis no longer has primaries, the staff recommends changing the requirements to mirror the state's deadlines. This change, made in consultation with Hennepin County, will standardize Minneapolis filings with the rest of the state. Finally, the city attorney's office recommended the addition of more specific language around the ordinance having to do with ties in election, including notice to the candidates and to the media. You can see the language on the last page of the ordinance in front of you. One quick note on the ordinance before you, the chapter number should be 167.75, not 165.75, and that'll be changed by Friday. That completes the review of the ordinance. I'm happy to stand for any questions, and also Carol Bashun, who helped from the city attorney's office, is here for any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Ebnet. I will go ahead and move approval of those amendments before we get going with any discussion. And do any council members have any questions or comments regarding the proposed amendments? No, seeing none, I would just wanted to say thank you to election staff, the clerk's office. You guys do an extraordinary job. And we are moving forward some really wonderful changes that I think will make our process more efficient and will hopefully expand the number of both registered voters as well as regular voters.
Mr. Chair,
Mr.
with your indulgence, one thing. Carol Bashun from the City Attorney's Office is here, and I wanted to especially recognize her. She's been an amazing partner to the Clerk's Office from the beginning. So from the very beginning, when this came forward in 2006 as a referendum issue, through the conduct of the first RCV election in 2009, my joining the department in 2010, and the conduct of the second RCV in 2013, she knows the process inside and out. She is not only a guide and an advisor to us, she helps explain sometimes the processes that we are supposed to be using to administer the election, and she is just a rock for the elections office. And so I wanted to especially recognize her in this very public forum for all of her work to help our department on this issue especially.
Excellent point, Mr. Carl. She has indeed done a tremendous job. And as late as this morning, I don't know if you were directly involved with this, but we were making a slight amendment to a process that I wasn't even aware that existed, which was in the event of a tie, you flip a coin. And that's actually in the state law, but can't imagine that actually happening, but it would be a beautiful political drama, to say the least. So thank you for all of your help. Again, any other further questions for Mr. Carl or Mr. Ebnett? Seeing none, I've moved approval. All those in approval, please say aye. Aye. All those opposed, say no. The ayes have it. With that, we have concluded all of our responsibilities, and this meeting is adjourned.